For question 1, you're asked to look at table 26 and list the two countries with the highest GDP, followed by the two countries with the highest GDP per person / high GDP per capita. If we look on the table, we see that China has the highest GDP with a value of $17,150,000,000, which is followed by the US with a GDP of $16,450,000,000. After that, and for the GDP per capita, we see that the US has the highest one with $51,622, which is followed by Germany with $44,067. Question 2. We're asked what's included in GDP. All goods, all services, or both? If we look at the definition of GDP, we see it's defined as the market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a year. So using this definition, we can say that it includes all finished goods and services, so both. Question 3. What happened to spending on medical services and recreational activities since 1950? As said in the Perusall, it was said that it increased to more than 10 times the level in 1950, which means that the GDP after 1950 reached a point where the value was 10 times the GDP level, 10 times the 1950s GDP.
In question 4, we're given a story about the speed of a car, and we're asked how it relates to reported GDP numbers. So obviously, just because someone hasn't been driving for an hour doesn't mean that they can't be measured in miles per hour. If they were to keep driving at that rate for an hour, that's how many miles they would travel. In the same way, GDP getting reported every 3 months can still be measured per year, just by saying that if the economy were to continue as it has been, that's what the yearly number will be. Moving to question 5, we're calculating the annual growth rate of nominal GDP given a few numbers, which is found by dividing the later year's GDP by the first year's. The first growth rate is about negative 13%, or around 87% of the previous year's. Second is about negative 19%, or 81% of the previous year's. And the final rate is about positive 4%, or 104% of the previous year's GDP. And now for question 6, we're asked what goods and services are counted in the country's GDP, so I'll go through them one by one. Used cars sold at a used car store is not counted because it is a used product that has already been counted in the GDP before. Your used car sold at your cousin's garage sale is also not counted since, again, this is a used product. Wine made in Napa Valley at a vineyard owned by Australians is counted because this is a product made in the US. Wine made in Australia at a vineyard owned by Americans is not, however, as this product was not made in the US. The price paid by a French tourist staying at a San Francisco hotel is counted. This is a service provided by workers in the United States, but the price paid by an American tourist staying in a Paris hotel is not counted because it's a service provided by and in another country. And a ticket for a Lakers game is counted because this is a new U.S. product service.
Question 7. By definition, is nominal GDP higher than real GDP? No. Even though inflation is usually positive, it could be that in the case of deflation, nominal GDP is lower than real GDP. Question 8. Looking back over the last 10,000 years of human history, which is more normal, for GDP per capita to grow or for GDP per capita to stay about the same? In the human history of technological innovation, non-stop over the past 10,000 years, GDP has pretty much been growing on average, with a huge spike in the past century or two. Question 9. We're using the Fred database once again to find real US GDP and looking at the change during the recession. So right before the recession, the highest level of GDP was $15,761,967. And after that, as soon as the recession began to subside, 2011 second quarter, the US GDP finally got up above that previous amount. Question 10 is another Fred question, so we're looking at y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, and we see that in the specified series the graph looks like this, So real gross private investment fell more than anything else in 2009, which makes sense because it was a housing crisis. And as we expect, the whole consumption is the largest portion of GDP. In the first quarter of 2010, consumption is $10,525.4 billion, and the total GDP is $15,421.844 billion. So consumption made up 68% of the GDP, which is about what we'd expect.
For question 11, we're interpreting the meaning of national spending identity. And basically, that is just the gross domestic product calculated in terms of national spending. That is, GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus the net export, which is equal to total export minus total import. For question 12, we're using what we learned in the textbook as well as what we interpreted in question 11, and we want to calculate GDP in this simple economy. So adding consumption, investment, government spending, and total exports together, and that minus the total imports gives us 150. Now diving into question 13, we're looking at the GDP for Robinson Crusoe. Based on the information given by part A, we calculate the GDP, and since there is no government, spending, investment, or net import and export, we just have to add consumption and investment together, and that gives us 4,400 pounds. If we move on to question 13 part B, something is different. Here we see that trading is happening. Since the other tribe is trading 10,000 clams for 500 fish, the total value of Robinson Crusoe's import is going to be 2,000 pounds, and the total value of the exported fish will be 500. That gives us a negative net export, which is negative 1,500 pounds. We know that with the increase in import, the consumption will also increase, and that gives us a consumption of 5,500. The investment will still be the same, which is 400, and that gives us a GDP of 4,400. If we apply the same strategy on part C, we know that the other tribe steals his huts, so that his investment in the huts is 400, but then he has a total export of 400 as well, and that gives us a GDP of 4,800. For part D, he gains, and so he consumes more, and that also brings up in the import level. And so adding all of those together, we get a GDP of 4,400 as well. For part E, we said that Crusoe is probably not happy about what happens in C, since it would feel like he wasted a lot of money in building huts that were eventually stolen. But he would be very happy about what happens in D, because it seems like he made gains without having to put in work, i.e. invest or involve in trade.